Welcome to the topic of whitespace. Now, whitespace is technically invisible, but it's still actually one of the easiest and fastest ways of drastically improving your designs. So, let's now go ahead and learn how to do that. So, whitespace is basically simply space between elements, but the right amount of whitespace can make our designs look clean, modern, and polished, and even more important, easy for the user to understand. Just look at this design, which has very little to no whitespace at all. So the entire content here looks very cramped, and it doesn't look clean at all, and our eyes do not really know how to navigate this page due to the lack of all this space. However, fortunately, it is very easy to fix this simply by adding some white space to the design. So now it does look quite modern and polished, and we can feel that somehow the design has some space to breathe. So this is in fact a dramatic improvement over the first version on the left side. But why exactly is white space so important? Well, white space automatically communicates how the different pieces of information in our layout are related to one another. And so by doing this, white space creates invisible relationships between the elements of the layout, which automatically makes it easy for the user to navigate that layout completely intuitively. Okay, and so now that we know what white space is and why it's so important, let's quickly learn how to use it. So, first of all, we should use a ton of white space between our sections. And going back to our previous example here, we can see that the designer did indeed add a lot of white space between these sections. So 192 pixels is a lot of space, but it is actually not too much. I think it does look quite right like this. And the same in this other design example here, where again there is a lot of white space between the sections. In this case it's just 140 and 160 pixels, but of course this will depend on many different aspects. You cannot just fix a number and then use that value of white space in all of your designs. Okay? Now the next place where you need to use white space is between groups of elements. So use a lot of white space there as well, but of course not as much white space as between sections. So here, for example, we have these different groups of elements, which we can clearly outline. And so between these, there is some white space, of course. And it is not little white space. So we have 96 there between the heading and then that first block of content. And then there is 152 pixels between these two rows. So it looks like it's a lot of space, but again, this is actually exactly the space that is needed to make this look clean and polished. And going now to our other example, here again we can easily see the different pieces of content, so like these groups of elements, where there are 24 pixels between all of them. So a little bit less here, but of course, once again, this will depend on many different factors. Now we usually focus more on vertical white space, but it's important to also think about horizontal white space, for example, like between these columns here. So usually vertically we need a lot more space than horizontally as a general guideline. All right. Now here I actually have another example, which is this one. And again, we can easily distinguish between the different groups of elements. And so of course, there has got to be some white space between them. And the same here in this other example. So again, two groups of elements here, and then we need to separate them visually simply by adding some white space in the form of margin, for example, in CSS. Now next up, of course, we also need white space simply between the smaller elements. So going back here to all our three previous examples, you have some white space here, as you can see by these arrows. Then also a lot of white space visible in this example. And finally, it's also easy to see here in this final one. And once you're aware of this, you will start seeing this white space on every well-designed website that you visit. So it's something that every website that has a decent design will use a lot. Now, another guideline that I can give you is that inside of groups of elements, you should always try to use whitespace instead of lines. So using lines might look something like this, and this is actually a mistake that many beginner designers tend to make. So they think that in order to basically distinguish between elements, they need to add some visual lines. So just like in this example. While actually it looks way better and way more modern and more clean to simply add some space between the elements, right? So here you can still clearly see which elements belong together, but all without using these ugly looking lines. And so if you're trying to create a modern looking design, then this is always the way to go. Okay, so now you know where you should actually use whitespace, but how much should you use? Well, let's find out with some more guidelines here. So basically, elements that belong together should be closer together in our interface, so have less spacing between them, because that will distinguish them from other surrounding elements or groups of elements. And what I just described actually has something like an official name, which is the law of proximity. All right. Now, on the other hand, of course, if elements are not closely related to one another, then they should be further apart, so that a user intuitively perceives that a certain element or groups of elements are unrelated to another group of elements. So again, all of this is the law of proximity, and this should be the guiding principle when you define how much white space you're going to use between elements or groups of elements. So of course there are some examples here, and here we have way too little white space. So this is all packed together very closely, and the relationship between these elements is not really visible. But on the other hand, here it is much better. So the title and the text kind of belong together, and so the spacing between them is a lot less than the space that's between the icon and the title. And so this is the law of proximity in action. Now another example is this form right here, which has some ambiguous spacing. So here on the left side, these text labels are kind of in between two input fields, right? And so like this, the user has a hard time of knowing which input field actually each label belongs to. However, if we remove the white space and place the label close to the input field that it actually belongs to, we can remove that ambiguity and therefore help the user navigate this contact form. And since this is so important, let's check out another example right here. So on the left side, it doesn't really make sense why this Learn More button is so far away from that text that it is actually about. So for some reason, it's closer to those links down there at the bottom. But again, that doesn't make much sense. And so why should that button be closer to that and not be closer to the text that it's actually about? And so fixing that is very simple, like we did here on the right side. So now the Learn More button is closer to what it belongs to. And so like this, it looks more natural and makes it all easier to understand. Now, next up, there is a guideline that many beginners find helpful when designing whitespace, which is basically to start with too much white space and then from there remove some space until it looks right. And again, of course, by doing that, we need to have the guiding principle of the law of proximity, and we also need to be aware that too much white space looks detached, while having too little white space, of course, makes the design look cramped. So here in this example, we actually tried that, and so we added way too much space, and actually right now everything looks kind of detached. So this is not good. And so in order to fix that, let's say that we actually removed most of the white space, but then it looked way too cramped, and we can also say that it even looks uninviting to read this text in the first place. So it looks like just a wall of text, which many times users do not like to read. But then, after experimenting around a little bit, and adding back some of the white space, we may end up with a result like this, which looks just right. So here we can feel that the design can breathe and everything is not too detached, but also not too cramped. So like this, it's perfect. And next, another guideline that might help you choose just the right amount of white space for your design is that you should try to match all the other design choices when it comes to white space. So for example, if you have big text or big icons, for example, then you will need more white space. So just like in this first example, here the text is huge, and so we see there is actually a lot of blank space here on this page, and also between the groups of elements, there is quite some white space there. Now, if you compare this to the design on the right side, here the text and the images are all quite small, and so therefore there is also a lot less space. So it would certainly look kind of unnatural if with this small content you would add a lot of white space between them. That just wouldn't feel right. Okay? And so again, you need to a little bit try to adjust your white space to all the other design choices that you already took. And now finally, when it comes to actually choosing the values for your white space in CSS, you can try to follow a hard rule just like we have been doing with the font sizes. Now, of course, you should not use the same rule as we used in typography, because that one is specially adapted for text. But instead, you can use a rule like this one, which only uses multiples of 16 pixels for all the margins and paddings that we apply on a page. Now, you will also need to add some smaller values like 2 and 4 and 8 and 12 pixels, but in general, from there on, all the other values are multiples of 16 pixels, and some of them are even skipped just in order to limit your choices. So it's the same idea as before with the font sizes, where I mentioned that limiting your choices is actually a good idea. So it sounds like a limitation, but it's actually great, because having to constantly think about what spacing we want to use can be really tiring. But if we have a system like this in place, then we can just choose a value, and if that one doesn't fit, then we go for the next one. And this one, believe me, will be even easier to use than the one for font sizes. So this makes designing much easier and faster, especially for beginners. And so we will use exactly this rule in our big project, and actually also in the one that we are doing in this section. However, before we go doing that, we will have another lecture in which we're going to talk about visual hierarchy. And so let's move there right now.